All right, so I think we can go ahead and get started with the amount of attendees. At any time, people, you can ask questions, you can send a chat. I'll be able to see it. I'm ADHD enough that I'll likely be pretty well distracted by any amount of that stuff. So don't worry about it necessarily, but also know I'll probably just go ahead and right away answer a question or rifle something off. So ostensibly, what you signed up to talk about was courage in the face of uncertainty. And so I'm going to start with just a little story. 1956, GM, General Motors, they toured the country and they unrolled all of these visions of the future, ways that we were going to travel into the future to audiences all over the nation. And they did so because they were promoting their concept vehicles, right? So here you have a group of four nice-looking white folks, and they're sitting in some LA rush hour traffic, and they're really upset about it. Anybody who's spent some time in rush hour traffic in LA probably knows how upset they are. These people are so upset they're singing a song, and the song is all about how terrible this is and how it's unfair to them that they should be sitting in this traffic all day. And so Junior has this great idea to change the radio station such that it actually automatically transports them into 1976. And in 1976, 20 years in the future, what they have is this jet-propelled vehicle, this concept car, and it is just barreling down the highway at over 200 miles per hour. And there is, they radio ahead because of the speed that they're traveling. They actually have to radio ahead to a guy in a tower who lets them know that they're all clear to get into the express lane, and they put the car on autopilot and they start going at an even faster speed with their jet engines and using a magnetic strip to guide the vehicle down the road. And in addition to it being jet propelled and moving so quickly, it's also air conditioned, which was a really big invention for 1976. And it's such good air conditioning, you can smoke a cigar right there in your vehicle while you're barreling down the highway. And Junior here is getting some orders from the back seat because the women have to sit in the back seat, obviously. So he gets an order for some orange juice and a couple ice cream bars so that everybody's comfortable in their vehicle. And they go whisking down the highway on their way to Chicago, which apparently the topography of the United States on the way to Chicago looks somewhat kind of like Utah. And they phone ahead to a place where they are going to stay for the evening. And in a video monitor into the screen, they talk to who runs the place. They talk to the inn owner about where they're going to stay in Chicago. So this was just a way in which people characterized the future back in 1956 for a group of audiences. And I roll this out to you, and I wanted to tell you this story today because, as a species, we have a history with the future. We have ways that we've talked about it for a long time. And our history with the future can be characterized pretty simply by the fact that we like to use our imagination. It's been inculcated into our education system early on. We talked about how much we like to use our imagination and activate it. And we like to use our imagination pretty much as long as it's just for fun. Kind of like what GM was doing here. We relegate imagination to some work that, while it's interesting, is actually just more so for fun or science fiction sort of purposes. But it also turns out that our history with the future can be characterized by this, and that we're terrible at predicting. And you can see this in the GM sort of model. The elements that they used to future were basically based upon what they thought audiences would think would be cool. Not necessarily what they thought could happen or did any form of analysis over how they'd respond to changes, but more so what would be cool. And thus what we are is really terrible at predicting. In particular, we're terrible at predicting futures that don't benefit us. It turns out through a lot of the cognitive sort of scientists over the years have seen that we're no good at coming up with anything that doesn't fit or conform to the biases we pretty much already have. And so the things that don't confirm our biases, we typically don't play with those kinds of futures. We typically predict things in a different way. And right now you might be thinking, yes, I know somebody who does this and they're irritating and I can't stand it because they always come to me when they're coming up with a new plan and it always seems to benefit them. Well, every human does this. You are not a human that doesn't do this. It turns out it's our default setting. It's sort of every time a human has to put themselves into a future, they typically characterize that future as a linear continuation of the present moment. Whatever's trending right now continues to trend, and we typically do this. And so don't feel too bad though, because even the smartest among us does this. So, Albert Einstein, arguably one of the smartest humans ever, says, there is not the slightest indication that nuclear energy will ever be obtainable. It would mean that the atom would have to be shattered at will, right? And he said this in 1932. He also apparently changed the spelling of his name. But he said this in 1932. And oddly enough, what was happening at precisely that same time was somewhere in Tennessee. There was a group of scientists that were already working on this. And just 20 years past 1932, you had Calder Hall in 1956. And so, we're not so good at knowing precisely what will happen. We have a lot of arrogance about what we think will happen, but we're actually, in retrospect, not that good at predicting. Over 40% of Americans believe Jesus will return to Earth by 2050. This was a Pew Research study done in 2010. So they asked people, before 2050, what is the likelihood that the historical Jesus will return to Earth? Over 40% of Americans believe that Jesus will come back. And so maybe the 50 million of us are right this time, but it turns out that it's one of the most oft-prophesied outcomes in our history. So all the way back to the Hippolytus of Rome in 500 AD, he actually did an analysis of what he believed to be the size of Noah's Ark. And on that data set, he said, it'll be 500 AD, right? So that came and went. John Wesley, he predicted 1836, and this was based on an analysis he performed of Revelations 12, a verse in Revelations 12. Again, comes and goes. So then we had Edgar C. Whisenant, who was a NASA engineer, and he wrote a book even on 88 reasons why it's going to take place in 1988. And went so far as to say, if I were a king if there were a king in this country and I could gamble with my life, I would stake my life on Rosh Hashanah 88. And it's a good thing he didn't, because Rosh Hashanah 88 came and went. He subsequently wrote other novels after it, predicting yet more farther out, sort of casting visions of when Jesus would return. And so, of course, none of those panned out, right? So our history with the future is that it's extraordinarily hard to let go of our biases, beliefs, and assumptions. This is built into the way we think. It's built into our species. It's how we, deal with uncertainty, is we typically will carry forward our biases, beliefs, and assumptions. And once something doesn't happen or does happen, similar to what happened with Edgar, we justify the mistakes or predictions by sticking to the biases. So we will look for evidence that supports that maybe we were right somewhat, right? And there's an author, Carol Tavris, she wrote a book called Mistakes Were Made, Just Not By Me. And she said that the trouble is that once people develop an implicit theory, the confirmation bias kicks in and they stop seeing evidence that doesn't fit. So some of this should be resounding with you. If you're the kind of person who's ever tried to design something, and that something could be a new business, that something could be a book or expression of what you want to do, that something could be a new department within your company, whatever that is, when you sit down to do that with a group of people and you're working only in the present day, typically the kind of visions that you'll cast or the kind of images you'll talk about are the ones that confirm the biases you already have. And what you'll often start doing is you will design something and with really smart people, right? And that something will live on into the future for a period of time, and suddenly something unexpected happens or something disrupts the thing, right? And it's frustrating. And so this happens in our organizations. It happens all the time. It happens because we're human, right? It happens because we're built with this sort of default setting. But there is good news on this, and that's why we're going to talk today. And there's something I want to give you guys today in this webinar, is that there are useful ways of thinking about the future, that there are useful ways to use our imagination. And one of the steps in making it useful is to first actually understand that when we're talking about something like the future, we're actually talking about something that doesn't exist. The future cannot be predicted. Why is it so hard to do? Well, because the future doesn't actually exist, right? The future is a construct of our understanding of what's happening to us. And while we have images out there, they are images, right? And the future is not a singularity out on the horizon somewhere, at which point we arrive. The future is a construct. It's something we make, and those are images that live mostly in our unconscious that we use to relegate present day decisions. And that's really what I want you guys to leave with is the future is alive inside of your present day decisions. The things you're doing, when you make decisions on what you're designing or what you're trying to build, you're actually making a bet on the future. That's what you're doing every time. So when we have those visions and we cast them out, there are useful ways to think about the future, or a different way to characterize it that is a good first step in trying to make your ideas heard, understood, and in articulating a vision that you may have. So probably the best first step, in addition to understanding that it is a construct, is actually understanding that the future is not a single point on a horizon, but the future is a possibility space. That there is a wide range of things that could happen. And if we can have that kind of an understanding, it's not unlike shining a light into a dark room, in that it will illuminate a number of pockets and areas in that room. And there will be an entire span of things that could happen. Now, similar, again, carrying forward the light metaphor, is that you have plausible futures on top as an overlay to understand. And these are things for which, at the edges of that penumbra that you're seeing on your screen, that these are things you can make out the shadows, you can make out the shapes, even somewhat at the edges, right? So you can kind of see them. And then an even deeper dive would be probable futures. So these are futures for which there's some statistical significance, or there's some reason why it is you believe that these would fall more squarely into the things that are highly visible. But even most importantly, and the thing that I really want to talk to you guys about today, would actually be your preferred futures. Your preferred futures are the things that you would really like to see happen. These are the things that you would prefer to have live in the world. These are the visions that you have. And if you have a topography or a way in which you can see that there is a scaffolding of the future that you're really interpreting, then you could better plot what those futures could look like and characterize them better, even to stakeholders that would maybe want to join with you in this vision. So if you're designing something and you have a vision and it plots somewhere out in the plausibility space, as opposed to maybe somewhere right in the highly possible sort of area, in the place where there's statistical significance, you can better characterize that kind of vision for the people that you would want to join in with you. So getting to know the future helps us to interpret this world of accelerating change and uncertainty. If we can get to know it that way, if we can use a lens and an understanding, then it helps us to get to know it. There's a story, and I think it might be apocryphal. I don't know that this is true, but it seemed true enough when I heard it, and so I was going to share it with you guys, is that, and I was actually a conversation I was having yesterday with a couple of people, and they said that, when the Spaniards first sort of came to the colonies, that the native people that were here in the United States, that they actually, the native folks could not see the ships. Like, they couldn't see the ships encroaching upon them. It wasn't until that they met people on the shore that they started to see that these ships were out there in the ocean. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that we have these confirmation biases, and we look for things that kind of look like us, and we look for things that would confirm what we already understand about the world. And unlike, maybe the situations that we've been in the past as a species, we have accelerating change. Those ships that are coming across the ocean, it feels like they're coming at us every day. We have changes occurring all the time, all around us. And in our organizations, no matter what industry you're in, if you're in finance, if you're in architecture, if you're a writer, if you're a creative person, the change is accelerating. So you don't have time to wait to see the ships. I think that if you can use a topography of the future, if you can use some of the tools I'll outline for you today, you can better see and interpret what those look like. So what in the world does it mean to be a futurist? What does foresight look like? I'm going to run through this super fast because I want to get you guys to a tool that you can use starting today to even start to investigate or think this way. But I wanted to run through first that there is rigor behind it. It's not just all crayons and imagination and super cool fun stuff. So how do you get to know the future? There is an entire discipline around this, and people have been studying how to interpret signals from the future for some time. So the first step involved in thinking about the future actually is a step called framing. And this is important, and this will seem very much like probably your normal strategic planning sort of stage, where you would say, what is it that we're talking about when we're talking about the thing that we're futuring, right? So is it our organization? Is it an industry? Is it an idea? Is it a business opportunity? What are we futuring, and what's connected to that thing? So what are the forces that are connected to it? How are those nodes attached? So let's frame all of that up, and let's make sure that we have the full picture of the thing that we're talking about. You know, if you're talking about an industry, what industries impact you? If you're talking about what trends do you already see happening? What are the things that people understand? You know, so you're scoping it, and you're coming up with like, what is it that we're talking about when we're talking about this? The next stage that you'd probably go through is scanning. So you would then say, okay, well then let's take a look at all of that system. Let's take a look everywhere, and let's look for the indicators of change that we could see happening. A lot of this takes place through data analysis, you know, through people who can pull data lakes of information, people who can take a look at articles, things that are being published, pockets of communities that maybe you didn't see before that are doing something different. So it requires some degree of research investigation. Then what you would do is you would use those signals to create multiple kinds of scenarios of the future. If some of those signals were to combine, what could happen? What could be out there? If we put ourselves to 10 or 20 years in the future in terms of a time horizon, what are the things that could happen? And if we have experiences with those, we begin to live into those futures, and we begin to have conversations that maybe we wouldn't have. We begin to talk about stuff that maybe is free from our present day circumstances, and we put aside some of those biases that we had because, well, we're living in a future, so we don't have to actually be right. It's not a thing that we constructed. We didn't cast this vision. This is just a place where we live now. And so we're going to have to understand and interpret the signals we're getting. You can begin to have conversations, and what they will do is create contours of what you would prefer. So when you then go to a visioning stage, you could say, well, the contours of the kinds of futures we prefer to create would be these. And in addition, if we see these kinds of signals showing up, this would be a future-ready strategy to change course, right? And so that would be the visioning stage. Then you would go into designing your plan. You'd create a prototype or an offering or an artifact that could test out that theory of your preferred future. And from there, you would adapt the plan as you would need to. So I know this seems really involved. It seems like a big undertaking. And so what I want to offer you guys is this. It's like, how can you make a beginning, right? So how is it that in your organization, you who you are right now, listening on the phone, watching this webinar, what could you do to make a beginning on thinking like a futurist and collapsing some of all of that sort of framework into something that you could make actionable today? So here is a way to do that. But first, I want you to just spend a little bit of time looking at your screen and checking this out, because understanding this would be important. So I know it's close to midday for a lot of folks, so maybe this is just, and maybe you're already eating lunch or checking your email or whatever you do during webinars. But you know, this is actually an artifact from a future, right? So what you're looking at here is a lunch of bios, and it's a synthetic biology lunch combination. So what you have is this young man who's at his school, and he's about to rip open his cultured cheddar with ham and crackers lunch, because inside of that box is a mini bioreactor. And so it's going to get him all the nutrients he needs to feel energized throughout the whole day. And just so you know, it is pro-GMO project verified and approved. So we know where the company stands in terms of how they embrace science and new developments. So why does this thing exist? What is it really doing? Well, what happened was this was actually created by a group called the Institute for the Future, and it was created for a group of food companies for them to interpret signals. So the signals that the IFTF saw, the Institute for the Future, was that there already actually is milk from cell cultures being created right now. So there are pockets of people who are doing that, and that there is a surge in interest for home kits for bioengineering, and that Lunchables as a group has already been saying that they're looking for alternatives. And believe it or not, there is a pro-GMO movement within the United States, because people are embracing more ideas about how can science be applied to helping to feed us in a more efficient way, and in ways that would obviate the need for traditional kinds of agriculture. So again, if you combine all those signals, what those people, those folks who are executives in the food industry, what they had to interpret was this, right? So they had an experience with an artifact, and they had to interpret that, and they came up with, well, what could happen then, and what would happen after that? And when you place yourself in that kind of a cognitive space, you're able to have conversations that really are about the things that matter to you, and not the biases that you'd prefer to see necessarily. And so again, why use artifacts? Well, you can use artifacts, and this has to do with the game that I'll show you guys that you can play with any number of people, but it's based on artifacts. So it's important to understand artifacts and why they're important, because they help you to drop those preconceived notions and biases. If there's any strength that foresight can bring to a situation, it's the ability to think in an innovative way about a problem, about the future of a decision, about your organization, right? So you can drop those preconceived notions and biases. You don't have to be encumbered by that, because we're not arguing about a present day decision. We've said, here's the future we're living in, and let's just talk about what we can do next and what happens after that. And it allows you for a moment to exit the present day, right? So for a moment, you put aside things and you exit the present day. And this should sound familiar to you, right? So artifacts from the future, not that weird. You know, so that the man in this photo, he is a high school teacher, and he's also working on the weekends, and he's looking at changing his career because he had this kid that arrived, you know, maybe just a few months ago. He likes spending time with this kid. That record player behind him is probably one of the most prized possessions he has, in addition to the kid, I suppose. The point of this is I'm the kid, right? So I'm the infant in this photo. That's my father. I don't remember this. Like, none of this is something that is inside of my present day memory at all. But does this artifact create for me a space in which I liminally move out of the present day and I begin to think about the values I have, or I begin to think about what's important to me? Well, absolutely. And so in much the same way, if we use an artifact from the future, we can have that same impact on the group of people we hope to influence, on a group of stakeholders that are aligned with us in a challenge we're facing together. If that dilemma is we can't find enough qualified people, we can't seem to get the contracts that we really like, we can't create a brand that speaks to the people that that we're trying to influence. We're wondering about the future of how it is we can continue manufacturing what we make. All those tough challenges that have a high amount of variables. If you can use something like an artifact, you can circumvent some of the traditional ways that we've been used to thinking, think in a new way, begin to have conversations free from bias. That's the point of the deal. So I'm moving pretty fast. I'm not seeing anything in the Q&A. I'm hoping everybody can hear me, and there's not anything in the chat so far. So I'm either blowing through a bunch of information or, but I wanted to take a pause here because I want to introduce you guys to the game concept that I have and spend some time showing you what that could look like. And then showing you an example of what it looks like when the insights from a game like this how they can be used, right? So the game that was it was developed here at Bigwidesky called the Futures Timeline, and it's a game that can help you to generate those artifacts. So the things I showed you, that lunch of bios thing, right? There's a way that you can start using today to generate the types of artifacts that could be helpful for you in facing a tough challenge. And it's based, the first thing to talk about, and you guys also you will get a quick start for this game. So you don't have to feel like you have to screenshot or that you have to take super good notes or anything like that. You'll receive a quick start guide on this, and that way you can begin to implement the game immediately. This is just an overview on how the game works. So the game is based first and foremost on what are called sometimes visions of the future and sometimes future archetypes, right? So the game is built on the 4 particular ways that people tend to cast visions in the future. This work was done by James Dater, the guy I quoted earlier that had that page boy haircut, who said the future can't be predicted because the future does not exist. He did a study on the way in which people cast visions of the future. He's done this for the last 50 years. He says there are 4 typical ways that people tend to cast visions of the future. The first way is called continuation. So that is generally characterized by saying whatever is trending right now and growing right now continues to grow. A majority of visions of the future are this way, right? It also typically is extremely positive. So these are like best potential outcomes. So again, packed with the way that we default setting wise typically take a look at the future. So AI that is prolific right now continues to grow. We're going to have more AI in the future. You saw the headlines with Elon Musk wanting to implant a neural device in everybody's head. Scary stuff. Either way, point is that is a very much a continuation vision of understanding what is machine learning and how does it line up with us, right? Collapse visions are very self-explanatory. Collapse visions say the systems that we thought were going to hold us together, they fall apart. So these are Mad Max scenarios. These are, if you liked the Black Mirror series on Netflix, right? So those would be things where the trending things that are occurring, the systems that held us together, those things fall apart and things go badly, right? Discipline visions. Discipline is essentially creating a new equilibrium. That's another word for discipline visions. Discipline visions say we've lost any hope that things will get better, but we sure don't want them to get worse. So discipline visions are characterized by all of the policies, procedures, things that you would do to make sure things don't get bad. So make sure to prevent collapse visions. Here's my discipline vision on how we can make things better. Transformation visions say the problem that we had is completely obviated. Something new comes along and it completely sweeps out anything that we thought, the problem that we thought we were facing, but instead it creates new problems, right? So we have new challenges, we have a new reality, a new basis. So one way that you can actually think about this too is like, if you take one interpretation, particularly Elliot Frick, founder of Bigwidesky, has of this is it's actually similar to the diffusion of sort of an innovations curve, right? So if you think about the automobile, well, and we should because we started with GM, I suppose, but if you think about the automobile, continuation vision, automobiles first are created and everyone is excited about the automobile. The automobile is going to be great. Cars are going to get us from point A to point B and it's going to go great. And then suddenly, I don't know if you guys know this, but like back in the 30s, people were getting killed all over the place with automobiles because there were no rules or anything. So people are up on the sidewalks and they're running over people with this stuff. And you know, people are getting hurt and it's suddenly like automobiles are bad. The technology is going to hurt everybody and it's not good stuff, right? So then if you think about what happened for a good amount of time with automobiles, some would argue we're still in it, is, you know, you had characters that showed up and said, well, it's actually, if you just drive here and you follow these rules and you have these signages and maybe let's put some belts in those cars and that way people will like not drive all over the place. If you think about Ralph Nader, who said that we should have, you know, signals, like these are people who said we don't want things to get worse, so let's just, can we just, is a way that typically discipline vision sound. Transformation vision says we don't need automobiles anymore. We're going to be like Will.i.am at that you know, awards show and just transport ourselves from one place to another. This is completely new technology and it obviates the need for a combustion engine of some kind, and you're going to transport yourself from one place to another via some other way, right? That's just an example. So it's based on this. So the game is based on some rigor behind the way that people have typically seen the future, the way that people typically visualize futures. And so I want to give you guys an example of this, and I think Sydney might be on this. So I'm gonna, if she is, I'm gonna let her raise her hand or do something, or pipe into the chat. But we were working with a group. Oh, there she is. Yeah. Sydney Plaza leads this organization called Security Advisor Alliance, and it's a membership organization of really, really smart people. These people are chief information security officers. Okay, so they're like your ethical hackers. but they also understand business systems, business logic, really smart, wonderful people. And Sydney, and for their part, as part of the Security Advisor Alliance, the goal of that group is to stimulate interest in that kind of career path, in the one that would be pointed toward leadership inside of a security kind of office. So that's the idea with the organization and why it exists. It's made up of some heavy hitters in that group. It's made up of people from Dell and from some big companies, and they do a good job. They tour the country and they actually stimulate learning with high schoolers and some other groups to make sure that they can get people interested in a career path that could involve security. A particular challenge that the group faces is a shortage, right? So there's actually more need for highly qualified people inside of security, inside of the CISO office, inside of that whole group, that management group, than we have qualified people to fill the positions. So a challenge that they had was, well, in particular, was that CISOs, which is the abbreviation for Chief Information Security Officers, CISOs are sometimes called CNOs, right? And the reason for that cutesy phrase is that if you've ever been in a room with someone who just has that security information, you tell them the thing you're trying to do, and they tell you why you can't do it. And so as a result of that kind of interaction over time, it's been understood that from time to time, certain organizations, security folks are kept out of the strategic decision-making kinds of conversations, and they're just informed later on what leadership, the other people in the C-suite, said they wanted to do. Well, this is a problem. In particular, if you want to recruit more people into being excited about that kind of an office, if it's typified that way, that's a challenge. And that's a difficult challenge, right? There's a lot of variables. It's hard to know how to address it head on. It's hard to know how to do enough analysis to know precisely what to do and how to advise a group of a membership group like the one at the Alliance on what it is they should be doing to change that, to shift perception, to tackle a problem like that. So they had the foresight themselves to think, well, this is a problem for which there isn't an easy solution. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, let's create a futures kind of dynamic experience for our leadership at our executive retreat, and let's figure out a way that we can use that to stimulate better conversation, set priorities. So that's what we did. We went to Dallas to their executive retreat, and we hundreds of CISOs in the room and people who are connected to the industry, and we actually gave them a scenario using this game. So using the futures timeline game, we went in there and we said, hey, here's what's happened. Since you're from a bulk of different organizations, we gave them a scenario and we made them all the same sort of person. So you are a CISO at Twitter. And inside the organization, there's an AI that was created that it's going to go out to all the tweets, and it's going to say, like, these people are real people verified. These people are bot accounts and they're not real. And this AI is going to go through the Twitter stream and figure out who those people are. But it turns out that AI is delivering false reports. It's saying certain bot accounts are actually real people, and they're not. They're bot accounts. And it also turns out, in connection with this whole Face app controversy, that all those bot accounts are from Russia. Well, now why would this be, right? So obviously there's a potential that there could be a data breach. Well, we looked and there was no breach. So now the question is, if there is no breach, and if they're still having trouble like this, then what should the role of the CISO be? What should that person do in that circumstance, right? So what we did is, since it is a controversial topic about where are the lines for Chief Information Security Officers, we went to the group and we told them, a certain number of you are going to lead a security team. You're going to find the source of the problem because data integrity is part of your role. So the CISO is responsible for this. And you're going to lead a team and you're going to get involved and you're going to create the solution. Group B is going to say, you know what, I know my lane. I know what we're supposed to handle and not. And so if there wasn't a security breach, not my problem. We're going to let the CIO and the tech team handle the problem, right? Neither solution is necessarily bad. Neither decision is necessarily bad. The thing that then became interesting is that when we put them into those main groups, we gave them all the task of casting 10 years in the future. If you made this decision present day, then 10 years in the future, give us the best possible outcome, what could be great about the decision you made in present day, either group A or group B, what could be potentially harmful about the decision you made, what policies, procedures would need to be put in place to keep things from getting worse 10 years in the future based on the decision you made, and what could be potentially transformative because of the decision you made in present day. And so each of these groups, they were divided up and they were asked to generate as many artifacts from the future as they can inside of those categories. So the way that the boards look, just as an example, is something like this. And you'll have ideas from all over the place in terms of what could happen. This particular one was from Group B, where the CISO is not responsible and he lets the CIO and their team handle it. And then what you'll have there is ideas across the board when it comes to what could happen as a result. And the thing that's powerful in terms of the experience people have is, for a moment, you have to put aside your preconceived notion, right? So maybe you're in this group, but you would prefer that the CISO be responsible. Well, now you have to come up with what would be the best case scenario 10 years from now if you made the decision you don't want to make. And so it's forcing you into a lane. It's forcing your mind to deal with possibilities that maybe you wouldn't have. And you begin to have conversations with people based not on your personality, based not on circumstances, not on politics, but on the future you found yourself in. And that the two of you need to figure out what could be, right? And if you begin to have those conversations, what you'll find are patterns. And that's precisely what we found when we did this exercise with them. I'm going to run through them real quick, just so you guys can see how you can perform some kind of an analysis on something, doing something like this, or even having a conversation like this. We found that these themes emerged across all different kinds of the artifacts. So even between Team A and Team B, themes around regulation. So there's a lot of unknowns, a lot of questions around who would regulate what, and would new regulation bodies need to be created if we aren't solving the problem? Okay, so then there were themes across the artifacts for innovation. So Team A saw that it could be that you could actually use the themes and the understanding of security to generate you could generate something innovative about the future. You could actually say something and use security to innovate something new, which is also not an idea that most people think about. Most people think of security as a stop on innovation. And Team B similarly sort of said, well, maybe if we say we're not fully responsible, it gives us a chance to collaborate with some other folks, and maybe that opens up more possibilities for us than we had considered before. So there is a theme around innovation. And then we saw that disintermediation was a theme, right? So if the CISO is not responsible for particularly for Team B, then that means if there's a death of the CISO, then what could happen is that information security becomes just a part of everybody's job. It could be that more information security is understood across the organization. There's all kinds of those kinds of theories emerging. The final one, which is probably the most abstract, had to do with truth. If data integrity is called into question, then to what degree and what kind of relationship does security have to truth in the future? Now, a lot of these are going to sound, and they already do sound, very abstract, and I understand that. The way in which we characterize this for this particular group, and what we like to do with the things that we gather from Futures Timeline, is something called tensegrity model. We're borrowing a term, an architecture term, and it looks like Janice already jumped on and said this is great, and I appreciate that, but it's an architecture term. It's Buckminster Fuller, right? So there are elements in integrity, elements in tension, and it turns out that if you were going to answer this question, right, not important the term we use, more importantly is this. If we're going to answer the question of how can CISOs have a future or cast a future for themselves, if they were going to set priorities, and if they were going to ask themselves really good questions, if they were going to create material, if they were going to address this problem inside of their organizations, then they need to optimize within these buckets, right? So to what degree do we allow for innovation to be part of how we deal with security inside of our business, right? To what degree do we understand that truth plays a role in the verification of the truth, and how do we deal with that from a security point of view, right? So it helps you to set priorities, have conversations you're normally not having, because what you're not doing is just casting forward all of the sort of political or circumstantial based conversations that you've typically had. And instead you're saying, hey, let's break this up into some themes and let's ask ourselves better questions about how we create a plan for our future. So again, the results that you get is you get priorities for optimizing your futures that you want. You get to play with just how far out on one of those kinds of tensegrities do we want to go? How much truth is too much truth for us? And how much truth can we handle? You get signals about the collective unconscious. In addition to seeing those themes emerge, you really do get a look at collectively, this is what people are really struggling with. Like from just a qualitative standpoint, you get to see the types of artifacts created, the nature, the language they use. You get to see how they feel about it. You also get a good deal of like the number of visions, right? Inside of a certain bucket, right? So if you ask somebody a question and most of their visions are collapsed, well, you know how they feel in present day about that thing. And this particular group got a report from members so that they can deal with planning. So what do you need to be able to play this game? What you really need is a controversial issue. You need something that's hard to tackle. You need something for which there isn't an easy answer. Something that has a lot of emotional sort of energy, but something for which there isn't a simple answer. Typically, it's best to get a gathering of stakeholders. In particular, you want diversity in that stakeholder group. You want people who come at it from points of view that you don't agree with. You want people who don't look and think like you. You want to create as much diversity in that gathering as you can in dealing with a particular problem. And you want a good statement about what that problem really is that you're trying to solve. You want to understand that archetype framework so that you can explain it. And like I said, you'll get a Quickstart guide, so you don't have to like perfect this. You can read off the Quickstart guide. And you'll get an analysis of some artifacts. So what you'll get are a bunch of artifacts of the future. And so I do want to spend just a little bit of time on what it is you would do with anything that you gather. And this is actually from a game that we played here locally all the way back in 2014. It wasn't the timeline, not the game that you'll receive the Quickstart guide for, but this is just to give you an idea and to drive home this notion that the future is not a point on a horizon. The future is not somewhere you're going to arrive collectively. The future is alive inside of your present day decisions. So you have this St. Louis partnership, and those of y'all who are local understand what that is potentially, but it's essentially the group that is ostensibly, they're supposed to help encourage people to locate their business in the St. Louis region. They're largely responsible for characterizing and basically marketing the St. Louis geography to the world, and to say, this is a place to locate your business, this is a good place to do business, that sort of stuff. Back in 2014, they were facing a big change. They had a lot of separate sort of agencies, organizations. They were folding into one. And so they wanted a digital way to express themselves. They wanted a sort of some better strategy regarding that. So what we did was we played a game with them, because it's a big problem, right? So you have all these agencies, lots of properties, lots of ideas on how to do it, lots of people who have investment and deep emotional tie to particular kinds of futures. And so what we did for them was we said, well, rather than trying to just do some form of appreciative inquiry of a bunch of people, let's cast you into a future and let's find out what's really important to you. And so that way, when we go to design something for the future, it's taking into account the things that you say are pointed and laddered toward your preferred future. So the scenario that we gave back in 2014 was that it was 2024, and Apple had decided to locate a headquarters in St. Louis. As unlikely as that may seem, it is also the kind of scenario that very much allows for people to exit the present day, right? So since it does seem provocative and potentially unlikely, that sort of thing helps people to exit the present day. And we asked them to play a game. And the game that we play with them is actually called Transpiration. And it's where you build a bunch of narrative trees. Essentially, it's like, and then what? So in 2024, Apple relocates to St. Louis, then what, right? Lots of trees built, lots of stuff that also would probably fall into the category of a collapse type of vision. There were problems. There were things that people foresaw as like, oh no, well, if that were to happen, then here's a challenge that could be exposed, you know, in particular. And so what we did was we reported back signals to them, and a particular signal that we found was that actually that they uncovered was that the potential exists for civil unrest due to gentrification, race, and socioeconomic issues, right? That may seem like a no-brainer to some people, but that was delivered to them on August 7th of 2014. And 2 days later, Michael Brown was shot. And an entire cascade was unlocked, and a new future that seemed to catch a lot of folks off guard suddenly emerged. But the thing that's strange, right, is that people, there were people inside of this organization that had that knew, you know, and it turned out that this partnership became the backstop for a lot of the public relations and the communications around what are we doing about Ferguson, and what are we doing about the fact that this actually has been around for some time. And so you could be characterized as, oh, you guys are soothsayers, you guys uncovered something, right? Like you foretold the future. And it's like, well, no, that future, that understanding that this could happen already existed inside of the organization in the present day. It's just that there is not usually, until you use foresight, until you use some kind of an artifact from the future, until you encourage a kind of conversation and a quality of conversation that isn't just the present day, it's hard to have conversations like, you know, hey, the potential exists for this stuff. What are we going to do about it? Like, what is the meeting that you're going to have? What group are you going to gather to have that conversation, right? So because you can set people and cast them into a future, you can begin to say, what are we missing? What are the ships that are coming in that we're not seeing, the things that we're blind to? What are those things so we don't have to be blindsided by futures we find ourselves in? How can we best prepare, plan, design something that can deal with those uncertainties? And so the point again being, the knowledge was already there. Knowledge was in the network. The knowledge lived inside of the collective unconscious of this group, and the future already existed. And the future already exists for all of you. But because we have bias, the insights are hard to access. The future's alive inside of your present, inside of you guys sitting here on this call in the middle of the day. It's inside the decisions you make every day. And it likely lives inside of pockets and the organizations you deal with, inside of people you interact with every day, inside of the minds of the people you don't get along with. They have notions and images of a future. And if you can use a game like the timeline, or like any number of sort of devices that you can use to cast people into futures, you can begin to see, what do they see on the horizon? What do they understand as being the most disruptive or the biggest opportunity that we could take advantage of that maybe isn't as obvious if we just ask present day sorts of questions? So you're going to get a quick start guide. You can ask me questions. You can, I hope you can post a dramatic interlude if you'd like, or you can just reach out to me if you have more questions about this. Everybody though who joined on the call, you're going to get the quick start guide for the timeline, and you can use that timeline for conversations with your spouse. You know, where are we going to go to dinner? Like, try out an experience or an experiment with saying, you know, well, what if we chose that, then what's the best outcome? What's the worst outcome? What do we need to make sure that things don't go badly? And what could be potentially unexpected about a decision like that? You can have those kinds of conversations, and instead of talking at people, you can begin to look toward a future together and begin to see what could be, and allow for yourself to let go of some bias, allow yourself the experience of what it's like to play in multiple sort of scenarios and futures. That's your webinar. I mean, I got to be honest, I don't think I've ever sat through a webinar. And so I'm probably like the worst judge of precisely how it is we go about wrapping. But I wanted to encourage you guys to look for that. Look for this quick start guide coming to you, Futures Timeline Quick Start Guide. If you have questions about it, you can reach out to me. I'm not seeing much in the Q&A or the chat, so I either like flew through this so fast that you're just like, whatever, it's the middle of the day, Jeremy, or I'm so completely clear that we're not going to go with that one. So What's one thing you would suggest to get folks to start changing their mindsets and think in terms of multiple preferred futures rather than one possible future? Well, it was fast and it is lunchtime. Thanks, Janice. So I think, John, a suggestion I have for beginning that conversation, it actually has to do, I mean, that's why I like to use artifacts. I like, it makes it easier to begin playing with that mindset and allowing them to have an experience with it rather than trying to explain the mindset. So in other words, here is an artifact or a thing from 10 years in the future, and let's talk about that. Or, one tool that a lot of futurists use, and I can send this to everybody as well, is a futures wheel. So in the center of the wheel, you place a decision or trend, like housing starts reduced by 20% or something like this, right? And then you build the wheel out with implications. So you begin to say, well, what could happen then? What could happen then? If you listen to the way you're asking the question, you'll even start to get through to people that there isn't one particular future, that we have decisions that we make that have a cascade of impact on all kinds of possible futures. So I hope that answered your question, but I think that, that's one reason for the use of artifacts over the use of sort of just, arguing about the logic of whether or not to do it. You are welcome. Cool. Well, I will take any other questions that you guys have offline. If you want to send me an email, you can even right now, and I'll go ahead and close it out. So that way you guys can get to lunch and get your calories in for the day. And I appreciate everybody who came to this webinar. It's the first time I've done one, to be completely honest. I'm usually more adept at hey, there's humans I'm interacting with. So I appreciate you guys being on this, and I'll send all y'all the Quickstart guide for the Futures Timeline. Thank you.